So it has been a while since I have made a video dedicated to the newer plays of Elden Ring. Today we're going to go over the top 10 best early game weapons. Now I am just going to go over the weapons that are very easily accessible and very beginner friendly. So you don't have to do a bunch of farming, you don't have to kill any hard bosses to acquire these weapons. Now the only areas we actually are going to be traveling to will just be Limgrave, Weeping Peninsula, and some parts of Caelid as well. I'm not going to include any other areas, even though you can go access a whole bunch of them very early on without having to kill other bosses, but to just make it more simple, we're just going to be including these locations. But also in this video, I'm going to tell you where to actually acquire the weapons themselves, and what are the best weapon skill pairings alongside some of the ones that can be infused, and maybe give you a little pointers on how to build around it as well. Also, if you are curious, all the gameplay that you will be seeing will be done at base level. I started off as the samurai, I didn't level up my character at all, and I just used a +3 Uchigatana to kill any types of enemies or bosses that I needed to. Even in the gameplay of me testing out the weapons that you're seeing, I just used the strength and the dexterity tiers to meet the requirements for some of the weapons. But if you do have any other additional questions, just let me know down in the comments, or you can just go check me out on Twitch and ask me questions there. I'm live every single day. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's just get into it. Starting off at number 10, we have the Claymore. Now this is going to be a greatsword, of which greatswords are an amazing weapon class. They don't do anything too flashy, but they just get very solid movesets, good damage, good stagger potential, and some very good weapon skill options. Now for the Claymore, this is going to be a strength-based greatsword that can be infused. Now unlike some of the other greatswords, it's probably not going to get the most amount of damage, but one thing that it actually does have is a unique heavy attack. Instead of having a horizontal swipe or a downward slam, it actually gets a poking attack, of which poking attacks and piercing damage is amazing in this game. A lot of enemies are just weaker to it, and typically poking attacks will just come out faster and just go further as well. So pairing this alongside a charged heavy attack build using the Axe Talisman and the Spiked Crack tier could work very nicely. But another amazing thing about this weapon is going to be its default skill. It comes with Lion's Claw. Now this weapon skill does a cool front flipping attack, of which has high amounts of damage, high amounts of stance damage, doesn't cost much FP, it's a quicker animation, and you basically get like infinite hyper armor, meaning throughout the entire animation, you're not going to get staggered out of it. Now, Lion's Claw can be accessible later on in the game, and you can put that on any type of weapon that you want to, but the fact that you can get access to it very early on in the game in a weapon like the Claymore, it's obviously going to be really good. Now, in terms of acquiring this weapon, you do have to go to Castle Morn in the Weeping Peninsula, which might require a little bit of traveling, but it's basically just heading all the way south from where you start off the game. Doesn't require you to kill anything, you can just pick it up off a chest, and you have yourself an amazing weapon. Number 9, we have the Great EPEE. Now this is a heavy thrusting sword, of which heavy thrusting swords are one of the better weapon classes in the game. They get probably the best two-handed moveset as well. It's just nothing but really quick poking attacks. They can stagger pretty nicely. Their running heavy attack is just the best running attack in the entire game. It covers so much distance at incredible speeds and does some really nice damage. Now typically when using these thrusting types of weapons, they'll kind of lack variety because they'll only will just get a bunch of poking attacks, which poking attacks are nice, but when trying to hit multiple enemies at once, it can be kind of lacking, of which the Great EPEE actually does fix this problem because its heavy attack does do a horizontal swipe. So if you are in need of a variety of movesets, the Great EPEE is going to be a great weapon for you. Now this weapon also can be infused. It does scale best off strength, although going into dexterity is almost just as good. And in terms of good weapon skills to pair alongside with this, leaving it with Impaling Thrust is going to be perfectly fine, although I think Stormblade is just going to be one of the better options. It is a very solid projectile attack, and projectiles can make this game incredibly easy. You can acquire Stormblade off Bernal at the War Master's shack, but in terms of acquiring the weapon itself, you can get it due east of the Argyll Lake South Grace. It would be in a chest surrounded by some enemies. Number 8, we have the Reduvia. Now this is a dagger, of which daggers I do not really like as primary based options. They don't really get that good at damage, the stagger potential is not that high, and obviously they have really poor range. But the trade-off being is that obviously they're really quick, but for how quick the moveset is, weapons like claws and fist weapons can just do the exact same thing but just perform a lot better in stance damage, movesets, and DPS. But the Reduvia itself is going to be a special weapon, meaning that you cannot infuse it and it gets stuck with its weapon skill, of which is Reduvia Bloodblade, which this is an incredible skill to have. It's a nice damaging projectile that causes high amounts of blood loss buildup, of which blood loss buildup in this game is incredible. Enemies will just get shredded and melted by this status effect. They just take chunk damage every single time that it does proc. So in terms of having a good early game bleed based option, it doesn't really get much better than Reduvia, although I do recommend switching off it later on in the playthrough if you do get access to the Bloodblade Ash of War. Basically performs the exact same way, but it just can do more damage, more stance damage, consume less FP and stamina, and you can put it on better weapon types as well, like a curved sword or a katana, and it'll just perform a lot better. But the trade-off being is that Bloodblade Ash War actually does decrease a little bit of your HP, which for early on in the game might be a problem, but once you get later on and actually have higher amounts of HP, it is not that big of a deal. But in terms of how to get the weapon, it is going to be off an NPC invasion. In the little lake section, you'll trigger an invasion. Now this invader fight is actually somewhat challenging, but you can just wait around for about 10 to 20 seconds, then another NPC will actually come and help you. But once you do defeat the NPC invader, you do get access to the Reduvia. Number 7, we have the Lance, which is actually the lone Great Spear in the entire game that can be infused, which automatically makes it very useful. Now, Great Spears themselves are an amazing weapon class, get a bunch of really good poking attacks, get some high amounts of stance damage. They can be coupled alongside a shield and you can block and poke at the exact same time. If you get yourself a second spear, the dual wielding combo can actually be really good as well. And another thing of which they do have is some really good weapon skill options. And with how good the scalings of this weapon actually can be with a lot of different types of infusions, it is very versatile with any single type of build. Now, it does scale primarily off your strength stat, but if you wanted to infuse it into a faith or intelligence type of build, you can do that and it can still perform really well. Now, the best Ash of War which I would infuse onto this early game would be Impaling Thrust. Very quick poking attack, high damage, high stance damage, doesn't consume much FP, and it's a very quick animation. You can actually acquire this from Bernal at the Warmaster's Shack. And in terms of the weapon itself, you get it at a very similar location, just a bit north of the Warmaster's Shack. And to the right, you can actually go jump off the little cliff and you can pick it up on the roof. Number 6, we have the Rusted Anchor, of which is a Great Axe that can be infused. One of the best strength weapons in the entire game, in my opinion. Now, Great Axes are pretty decent weapon class. Get some pretty quick movesets, nice damage, some okay stance damage. They tend to be outclassed by Great Hammers, because Great Hammers will just end up getting higher stance damage, of which they can just stagger enemies quicker. And they get striking damage over standard damage, which striking damage tends to be a bit better. But one thing that the Rusted Anchor actually does get over the regular Great Axes is that it gets access to piercing damage, of which I mentioned it early in the video. Piercing damage is probably the best damage type in the entire game. A lot of enemies are weaker to it and not many are actually resist. And the great thing about piercing damage is that when you hit at the exact same time of which an enemy is attacking, it will do counter-attack damage, which is basically just going to be bonus damage. And pairing this alongside something like the Spear Talisman could help improve the damage even further. So the Rusted Anchor actually has some of the highest damage potential in the entire game. Now, in terms of weapon skill options, there are plenty of things of which you can go with. Great Axes get amazing options like Flaming Strike, Sword Dance, Vacuum Slice. A really good earlier game option, in my opinion, would be either Wild Strikes or Flaming Strike. Wild Strikes can be acquired earlier on in the playthrough. It is just north of the Stormhill Shack of a Teardrop Scarab. And in terms of acquiring the weapon itself, it is going to be in the Weeping Peninsula at the Morn Tunnel, which yes, is going to require killing a boss, but the boss itself is not going to be that challenging at all. As you see in the gameplay, I just had a +3 Uchigatana. I'm just spamming the weapon skills and it just doesn't stand a chance. Number 5, we have the CROSS-NAGINATA. This is going to be a bleed-based spear. It does scale primarily off your dexterity stat. And typically, spear weapons can be very nice because they obviously get access to piercing types of damage, of which what I mentioned, piercing damage is amazing. But typically, spears will actually lack in a lot of variety because they just get nothing but poking attacks. But the CROSS-NAGINATA actually does get a unique moveset. The light attack combo gets a nice mix-up of vertical swipes, horizontal swipes, and poking attacks. And the fact that it gets access to bleed and some of the most range in its class, it is going to propel it to be one of the better weapons in the entire game. And another good thing about spears themselves is that their power stancing or dual wielding combos are just really good. Picking yourself up another spear and putting it in your left hand can be extremely powerful. Those combos can actually output a lot of damage really quickly, although that's not really something that's optimal early on in the game. Now, one downside that I probably could say about the CROSS-NAGINATA is that it does have higher requirements at 16 strength and 20 dexterity. So you might have to kill a couple of bosses beforehand to actually reach that amount. Now, in terms of what I'd pair alongside with the CROSS-NAGINATA, being that actually can be infused and buffed, I recommend definitely putting on the Blood Flame Blade spell. This is going to be a nice bleed-based buff. It just adds on to the bleed that you already get. You do get this a little bit later on in the playthrough, but that should definitely be a priority on your list. And once again, go with Impaling Thrust. This is such an easy to use weapon skill that just nets you very high rewards. Maybe later on in the playthrough, you could do something like Stormcaller or Spinning Strikes once you do get access to more bleed. And in terms of how to get the weapon, it is actually going to be in Caelid, but it is very early on in Caelid at the Gale Tunnel. You don't have to kill any bosses. All you're going to do is enter the Gale Tunnel, which does require a little bit of platforming down to the bottom. I actually don't recommend lighting up the grace because the only way out of the tunnel is to actually just run all the way through it, which is not that bad, but if you're going to pick it up very early on in the game, you might struggle a little bit. So I recommend just following the path, go towards where those big octopus are, just pick up the weapon itself, and just die. Because when you die, you just teleport back to the original grace of what you started at, and you don't have to worry about running through the entire dungeon itself because obviously you can't teleport out of a dungeon. Number 4, we have the NAGAKIBA. Now, I consider this one to be the best katana in the entire game, and katanas are an amazing weapon class. Really quick movesets, they get access to bleed, good variation in moveset, pretty decent range, nice damage, good DPS potential. The weapon skill options are incredible, and for the NAGAKIBA itself, this one is probably going to be the best in class because it can actually get some of the highest damage, if not the highest damage in some types of builds, but also just gets amazing range. It gets so much more range than all the other katanas, and also just gets the best moveset. A lot of other katanas, their heavy attacks will get some vertical swipes or horizontal swipes, whereas the NAGAKIBA gets nothing but poking attacks, which combined with the amazing range and doing piercing damage, it's just going to be really good. Now, one downside of the NAGAKIBA is actually does have higher requirements than the other types of katanas. Requires 18 strength and 22 dexterity, so it's probably not going to be something that you can use right at the beginning until you actually kill a couple of bosses first. So I actually recommend going with the Uchigatana instead, of which the Uchigatana you can get by just starting off as the Samurai class, or you can also just get it as the Death Touch Catacombs. You can just follow the pathing and you'll see exactly where to get the Uchigatana. It is going to be a lighter weapon, does have less requirements, but the range itself is going to be a lot less as well. But it can be a good alternative until you can get the NAGAKIBA, of which getting the NAGAKIBA does make you have to kill an NPC. After you kill the NPC invader, of which I talked about earlier, to get the REDUVIA, you can meet that same NPC that helped you out later down the path, and you can kill him in this instance to actually acquire the NAGAKIBA itself. Now, killing him will actually end the questline early, and you actually might miss out on some story elements. But if you were concerned about items, the only item that you actually do miss out on would be the Raptor or the Mist Ash of War, which is not too good of an Ash of War to begin with. It is more situational than anything, but you actually can progress this questline and you actually will gift you the NAGAKIBA itself. All you have to do instead of killing him is exhaust his dialogue, and then you'll meet him again later on at the main academy gate in Raya Lucaria, and you can just help him out with another invasion. And at that point, he will just gift you the NAGAKIBA itself. And when you do acquire the NAGAKIBA, it actually does come with the piercing Fang weapon skill. Now, what I recommend is just removing it altogether because Unsheath is a skill that's default to the katanas, and Unsheath is incredible to have. It is very quick, incredibly cheap, and does really high amounts of stance damage. I think this is just one of the best skills in the entire game. If you're using a katana, this is going to be one of the better options. Number 3, we have the Greatsword, which this is actually not a Greatsword. It actually falls under the Colossal Sword category. Really large weapon, good nice horizontal swipes in terms of its moveset. It does get some really nice poking attacks with the rolling and crouching attack. But what makes the Greatsword so good is that it's going to be the best Colossal Sword in the entire game. It gets the most range and it just gets the most damage. And paired alongside certain types of weapon skills, this thing can just trivialize the entire game. Now, the downside to the Greatsword is that it can be on the heavier side and it does have a 34 strength requirement. So if you actually did want to use a Colossal Sword right at the beginning of the game, I recommend going with a Zweihander instead. It weighs a lot less, it doesn't have that high of a requirement, and it arguably gets a better moveset as well because its heavy attack is a nice poke. It's not going to get as much damage as the Greatsword nor have as much range, but it is a lot more accessible. But if you do spec into a little bit of strength or actually use the strength not tier, which is also accessible very early on in the game, you can just meet the requirements for the regular Greatsword. Now, the best pairing for the Greatsword would have to be a Lion's Claw. Lion's Claw is probably the easiest weapon skill to use in the entire game. Really high damage, good stagger potential, not that expensive, and you just never get staggered out of it as well. Now, the only unfortunate thing is that Lion's Claw might be a bit challenging to acquire. You can get it pretty early on in Caelid at Fort Gale. Once you go around the fort and climb up the ladder, which, by the way, next to the ladder on the other side of the fort, there's actually going to be an item there called Flame Get Me Strength that is an amazing spell to have. Is a good body buff, only requires 15 faith and it just boosts your damage. So I definitely recommend picking that up if you ever feel that you're lacking in damage. But yes, to acquire Lion's Claw, you're going to need to kill this lion, which might be a pretty challenging fight. Might take you a little bit, but it definitely is worth it. But in terms of how to acquire the Greatsword, it is going to be very early on in Caelid. Just follow the main path until you get to a carriage that has the weapon inside of a chest. Number 2, we have Death's Poker, which is one of the better intelligence-based weapons in the entire game. It is a great sword, which I mentioned before, great swords. Very nice moveset, good damage, good stance potential, nothing too crazy. This thing actually does get a unique heavy attack, in some cool upward cut. Also nothing too flashy, but it is nice. But yeah, the best thing about this weapon is going to be its skill. This thing is going to be a special weapon, so it can't be infused. So it's just going to be stuck with this skill. You can't change it up at all. But its skill, Ghost Flame Ignition, does summon this cool Ghost Flame Ball that actually does a bunch of frost damage, of which Frost Buildup is an amazing status effect to have. Once procced, it actually does do a chunk of damage to the enemy and make them take 20% more damage for the next 20 seconds, meaning in that time you can just output even more damage. And actually does give you the follow-up option, whether you click the light or heavy attack, to do a nice trail projectile or a nice AoE explosion. That trail effect is probably going to be the better option. It just outputs more damage. And that in combination with just using regular light attacks, it can just make for a very deadly combo. Now, the only unfortunate thing about this is that you have to acquire it off killing a Deathrite bird, of which these enemies are very challenging. And the one you actually have to kill is going to be located in Caelid, which is somewhat towards the end of Caelid, so you have to do a little bit of running to get to this location, and it only does spawn in at nighttime. Now, thankfully, there actually is a way to make the bird just fall off the cliff by itself. Just follow the gameplay as to what I'm doing, and it'll just eventually just fall off the ledge. Now, if you are having a problem with this, I do have a whole dedicated video on how to get this weapon very early on in the game. Actually upgraded a whole bunch, have a whole build set out around this as well, and I use a different alternative method to kill the bird itself using holy pots. So if you actually are having problems trying to kill this bird this way, I recommend checking out this video. And at number 1, we have the Bloodhound FANG. This is going to be a curved greatsword, of which this weapon class has very solid movesets, pretty quick, nice amounts of damage, get very good reach. The heavy attacks come out incredibly quick, also do high amounts of stance damage. And for the Bloodhound FANG in particular, it gets some of the most range, gets amazing damage, actually does get boosted damage on jumping attacks. And this thing also can be buffed despite it being a unique weapon that cannot be infused. And being that it has bleed on top of this, you could pair this alongside the Blood Flame Blade spell to just further enhance the bleed. But the fact that you're just getting amazing damage, amazing moveset, and bleed for a weapon that only requires Somber Stones to upgrade is going to be really good. But as for the Bloodhound FANG skill, Bloodhound's Finesse, it's a nice high damaging attack. Actually does get a follow-up iframe dodge into a high damaging attack. And it's very cheap, does high stance damage, and it's very easy to use too. And the best thing about this, it is probably going to be the earliest one to acquire as well. Just south of the Argyll Lake South Grace, you go straight to the Everjail, and you kill the boss that's inside of it. If you are having problems, which you probably shouldn't be, you can actually go to the Mistwood Ruins, because there actually is going to be an NPC there that you can speak to. Now, to actually trigger this NPC, you have to go to the Mistwood Ruins, then head back to the Church of Ella to speak to Carlay the Merchant. And once you get the Snap gesture, you can go back to the Mistwood Ruins where you hear the howling, use the gesture, talk to the NPC, and he can actually help you out in the boss fight itself. Anyway, that concludes the video. If you have anything that you want to say or any opinions, just let me know down in the comment section below. And definitely do like and subscribe as well, because I have a whole bunch more videos coming along the way. And definitely do check me out on Twitch, because I am live there every day doing a bunch of random challenge runs or just doing random marathons playing the other Souls games, whatever it may be. Definitely give me a follow there as well. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.